Greetings, friends. I'm going to read some selections from The Geography of Nowhere, The Rise and Decline of America's Man-Made Landscape by James Howard Kunstler. This book came out in 1994, but I feel it still has very relevant information for today. We have a lot of the same problems, although the problems have intensified, and the same poor models and poor thinking applies both to the urban architects and city planners and our culture in general. Kunstler is a good writer. I recommend his book. A few pages into his first chapter, titled American Space. Regarding the Puritans, the founding families of a town formed a covenanted corporation that held title to all the land and then dealt out home lots based on family needs and social standing. The land was not paid for per se with money, but each signatory to the covenant was obliged to erect a house within 2 or 3 years, to pay taxes, and to help support a church. A family with many children got a larger lot. Bachelors got smaller ones. Men with desirable skills, such as blacksmiths, millers, and ministers, were attracted by offering double and triple allocations. The Puritans were not egalitarian. The idea of a social order based on hierarchy of position was natural to them. Wealthy or exalted persons got bigger allocations. Even so, the distribution of home lots in this early phase of settlement was most equitable by later standards. For in laying out the physical plan of their towns, they were also laying the foundation of an economic system that they hoped would be stable and enduring. The object of this way of life was not to grow surplus crops for market, but to achieve a sort of drowsing medieval stability based on self-sufficiency and a dour preoccupation with getting to heaven. The church, or meeting house as they called it, was the center of civic as well as spiritual life, the adhesive that held the town together. At times it was even used as a granary or a warehouse. Everyone had to belong to the congregation and attend its services. Massachusetts passed a law in 1635 forbidding settlers to establish homes more than a half-mile from the meeting house, although this law was repealed 5 years later. Roads were practically non-existent between these towns. The towns were generally sited near water, and goods and people moved by boat when they moved at all. For a couple of generations, this pattern held. In contrast to today's heedless lust for growth at any price, the Puritan towns observed agreed-upon limits. A consensus emerged within each town when it had reached optimum size, and then no more lots were granted. Of course, this did not stop settlers from coming to Massachusetts. Through the first 2 generations, the court solved the problem by simply chartering new towns as required. But that too eventually reached a limit. The medieval pattern, the model of changelessness itself, based on an ever-stable population with births equaling deaths, could not survive the relentless pressure of immigration. At any distance from the seacoast, it was more difficult to establish viable towns, and the resident Indian tribes were not easily dislodged. Instead, new villages began to form within larger, existing coastal townships, each with its own church congregation. This led to conflicts in town management. In the South, the individual, not the group or even the family, became the primary unit of settlement, bound neither by religion, kinship, nor community. The Virginia colony, from Jamestown on, was an enterprise of freebooting egoists. Single young men outnumbered females nearly 20 to 1. Many expected to get rich, return to England, and live out the rest of their lives in leisure and luxury. Hawke calls it an abnormal society in which manners and morals collapsed. Looking to make their quick fortune, men carved tobacco plantations along the shores of Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac, York, James, and Rappahannock estuaries. Their agricultural practices were ruinous, and after exhausting one piece of land in 5 or 6 years' time, they would move on to another. With so much coastline available along immense Chesapeake Bay alone, anyone could start his tobacco plantation near the water's edge, and ship out a crop packed into half-ton hogsheads from his own landing. The Revolution swept away the prerogatives of the crown, which had been associated with English land tenure in America. In America, ownership meant freedom from the meddling of nobles, the right to freely dispose of land by sale at a profit, the ability to move from one place to another without hindrance, to enjoy the social respect of other smallholders, and to have a voice in matters of community interest. The Revolution also got rid of such obnoxious English traditions of inheritance as primogeniture, the law that awarded all of a man's estate to his eldest son, and the right of entail, which allowed a landowner to forbid by will the future sale of his property by his descendants. After the Revolution, Americans adopted what came to be called fee simple land ownership. The term derives from feudal times, when all land ultimately belonged to the crown. Those who lived on it, from lord to churl, were obliged to perform services, example, fight in the Crusades, and pay fees, in crops or in money, as a condition of their occupancy. Land held with the fewest strings attached came to be known as fee simple, the fee being simple cash payment. But in England, fee simple ownership would remain relatively uncommon until the rise of an industrial plutocracy in the mid-19th century. American land law was predicated on the paramount principle that land was first and foremost a commodity for capital gain. Speculation became the primary basis for land distribution. Indeed, the commercial transfer of property would become the basis of American land use planning, which is to say, hardly any planning at all. Somebody would buy a large tract of land and subdivide it into smaller parcels at a profit, a process that continues today. In Chapter 3, titled Life on the Gridiron, Kunstler says, regarding the large amount of land available to be settled after the Revolution, a system was needed to divide it up for sale. The answer was the national grid. The grid was a product of the era's neoclassical spirit, at once practical and idealistic. It was rational, mathematical, and democratic. It was fair and square and easy to understand. However, the national grid had some serious drawbacks. It failed to take account of topography. The relentlessly straight section lines followed the compass, marching through swamps, across rivers, and over hilltops, a transcontinental triumph of the abstract over the particular. In terms of rural life, the grid institutionalized the trend toward scattered farms rather than agricultural villages, which gave expression physically to the powerful myth that only lone individuals mattered in America. The grid was primarily concerned with the squares of private property that lay within the gradients, not with gradients themselves or how the two related with one another. This dictated a way of thinking about the community in which private property was everything in the public realm, namely the streets that connected all the separate pieces of private property counted for nothing. The grid had some salient advantages as a planning scheme for cities. Rectangular lots made for good economy of building. The grid made orientation easy. For example, in New York, one was obviously going either up or downtown on numbered streets, and the east-west fix was pretty easy too. The four-way intersections at every block allowed for flexible traffic patterns, particularly with slow-moving horses and wagons. In Chapter 5, titled Yesterday's Tomorrow, regarding the current world that America existed in the 1990s, he says that we can't let architects off the hook because with their hubris, which resembled religious zealotry, these architects set out on a great purifying mission that damaged the whole physical setting for civilization in our time. The dogmas that guided them went by the name of modernism. Heretics and skeptics were anathematized as systematically as the opponents of the 15th century Vatican. Modernism did its immense damage in these ways: by divorcing the practice of building from the history and traditional meanings of building, by promoting a species of urbanism that destroyed age-old social arrangements and, with them, urban life as a general proposition, and by creating a physical setting for man that failed to respect the limits of scale, growth, and the consumption of natural resources, or to respect the lives of other living things. The result of modernism, especially in America, is a crisis of the human habitat. Cities ruined by corporate gigantism and abstract renewal schemes. Public buildings and public spaces unworthy of human affection. Vast, sprawling suburbs that lack any sense of community. Housing that the unrich cannot afford to live in. A slavish obeisance to the needs of automobiles and their dependent industries at the expense of human needs. I will summarize the sort of case he makes in the rest of the chapter. I mean, unfairly, briefly, but just, in a nutshell, he says that modernism was a reaction to industrialism, but it didn't try to challenge industrialism and try to appropriate industrialism and roll with it, kind of. And unfortunately, that was a bad strategy, because it assumed that, okay, so we're going to be machines working in factories, then let architecture be for machines, and let the house be a machine to live in. And things started turning into big blocks. And some of the modernists were even fascinated by grain elevators and silos out in the Midwest. Like in the 1890s, they were inspired by modern farm buildings. In chapter 6, titled Joyride, Kunstler says, "A civilization completely dependent on cars, as ours is now, was not inevitable. The automobile and the electric streetcar were invented and made commercially viable at roughly the same time, the period from 1890 to 1915. However, the automobile, a private mode of transport, was heavily subsidized with tax dollars early on, while the nation's streetcar systems, a public mode of transport, had to operate as private companies, received no public funds, and were saddled with onerous regulations that made their survival economically implausible. The electric streetcar was the logical successor to the existing system of urban horse cars. The horse car lines, fixtures in American cities since the 1850s, had obvious limitations in speed and power. The animals tended to be abused and worked to death. They created a public health problem with their manure, and when they dropped dead on city streets, a frequent occurrence, 15,000 a year in New York at the turn of the century, feeding and stabling them was expensive, and it took up a lot of space. The technical problems that had stood in the way of a practical electric streetcar were solved in the 1880s by Frank Julian Sprague, a former naval engineer who had briefly worked for Thomas Edison. Sprague invented a flexible cable that transmitted electricity from an overhead wire to the streetcar's electric engine, thus eliminating the danger of an electrified third rail at ground level. The device was called a trawler because it was pulled along by the car much the same way that a fisherman trolls a lure. By the turn of the century, half the streetcar systems in the United States were equipped by Sprague, and 90% were using his patents. The streetcar's heyday was brilliant, but brief. It operated cleanly, and it moved large numbers of people very efficiently at even cheaper rates than the old horse cars. In the United States, streetcar lines tended to charge a flat fare for a ride of any distance and offered free transfers, as opposed to Europe, where the fare was based on the length of the trip. There were two reasons for the flat fare. First, it encouraged weekend joyriding. Second, it helped promote the desirability of commuting from new suburbs at the urban fringe. And it became common for streetcar companies to engage in suburban real estate development. Sometimes real estate was their prime objective and the streetcar was merely the tail of the dog. The Streetcars could move 10 to 15 miles an hour, and they helped open up the nether reaches of the city to poor working people who previously could not afford to travel from their neighborhoods. Streetcar companies were also heavily involved in the building of amusement parks on the urban fringe, another spur to weekend riding. At the same time that the cities expanded beyond the old walking limits, downtown business districts boomed from the mass influx of shoppers the trolley now brought from all over town. And jumping ahead a bit in the chapter, he describes how the automobile started to take off, especially during the 20s with General Motors under Henry Ford. While Ford and his competitors churned out more than 1 million new vehicles a year in the 20s, politicians and planners soon began a massive restructuring of American cities to accommodate the growing ranks of middle-class motorists. City planning boards were often dominated by realtors, car dealers, and others with a keen personal interest in advancing auto use, and little thought for long-term consequences. By the 1920s, a group of special interests from tire makers to the building trades had coalesced to lobby for the auto. There were fortunes to be made, especially in quote-unquote development. The streetcar lines had promoted suburbs of a limited scope, a sort of corridor out of the city, because nobody wanted to live more than a few minutes' walk from the trolley stop. The auto now promised to fill in the blanks between the streetcar corridors and then to develop open space far beyond the city limits. The costs to the public mounted early. A commission under President Hoover concluded that the automobile was the most potent influence on the rise of local taxes between 1913 and 1930. The price of building new roads and repaving the old cobbled city streets was staggering. Chicago spent $340 million on street widening alone between 1910 and 1940. The new low-density auto suburbs required expensive sewer and water lines to be laid before the new homes were sold, meaning that the carless urban working class had to pay for the new infrastructure that the car-owning middle class would enjoy. Police forces were motorized, and many new officers hired specifically to control increased traffic. Stoplights by the thousands had to be installed, but perhaps the greatest cost to the public was one that can't be quantified in dollars: the degradation of urban life caused by enticing the middle class to make their homes outside of town. It began an insidious process that ultimately cost America its cities. The federal government got into the act of subsidizing auto use in 1916 with the $75 million Federal Road Act to improve post roads and encourage the states to organize their own highway departments by giving them money. There were a few more government actions which helped the auto take off. By contrast, streetcar companies received little government support, and the organized auto interests conspired actively to kill them off. By the eve of the First World War, lines were already hard-pressed to make a profit, and as private companies with stockholders, they had to make a profit to justify their existence. Anyways, there were some failings on the part of the streetcar companies, but together with the conditions, there was a spiral of decline, service got worse, ridership declined, profit vanished, upkeep had to be deferred, service got worse, and so on, until they went bankrupt. Some of these trolley companies were partly at blame in their demise. Some of them watered their stocks. Others rose and fell with the success of their associated real estate ventures. In 1925, with the acquisition of the Yellow Coach Company, the General Motors Corporation undertook a systematic campaign to put streetcar lines out of business all over America. General Motors erected a Byzantine network of subsidiaries and holding companies to carry out its mission, using its financial muscle to buy up streetcar lines, scrap the tracks, and convert the routes for buses. General Motors also moved to horn in on regular railways, becoming the largest stockholder in the Greyhound Corporation, which bought all its buses from Yellow Coach. Sniffing opportunities among financially troubled railroads as the Great Depression deepened, GM organized a holding company called the National Highway Transport Corporation, which became Atlantic Greyhound Lines, to provide intercity bus service in the Southeast. In 1932, General Motors formed the United Cities Mobile Transit Corporation to create a market for its products by taking over streetcar lines in small cities and converting the lines to buses. UCMT was dissolved in 1935 after the American Transit Association censured it for trying to dismantle Portland, Oregon's electric trolley lines, but this didn't stop General Motors. That same year, the Mammoth Company joined with the Omnibus Corporation, whose chairman was also head of Yellow Coach, in a scheme to replace New York City's electric trolley system with buses. The switch was loudly endorsed by Mayor Fiorello H. LaGuardia, who viewed streetcars as hopelessly antiquated. The conversion of Manhattan was largely accomplished in an 18-month period, despite a hue and cry among the riders. In 1936, a combination of General Motors parts suppliers, Standard Oil of California, and Firestone Tire and Rubber formed a company called National City Lines. 2 years later, National City Lines spun off an affiliate called Pacific City Lines and proceeded to buy and dismantle streetcar systems in San Jose, Stockton, and Fresno, California. In 1943, another NCL affiliate, American City Lines, converted trolleys to buses in 19 more cities, including Pacific Electric's Big Red trolley line in Los Angeles. A federal grand jury indicted GM for criminal conspiracy in the Los Angeles case in 1949, but the eventual fine of $5,000 was about equal to the company's net profit on the sale of 5 Chevrolets. By 1950, GM had converted more than 100 electric streetcar lines to gasoline-powered buses. This tale of greed was finally aired in a 1974 investigation by the Senate Subcommittee on Antitrust and Monopoly, but by that time it was ancient history and the damage could not be undone. GM defended its actions, saying that all the buses they had sold and their aggressive deployment of capital had given mass transportation a new lease on life at a time when times were hard and transportation systems were collapsing. Anyway, the question of exchanging buses for streetcar tends to obscure the greater issue. General Motors' ultimate goal was to replace public transportation with private transportation, meaning the car, and in this they triumphed. The bus was only an excuse to rip up the trolley tracks, which cluttered up the street and represented a difficult and competing technology. By the time the Hart Subcommittee held its hearings, only the lowest orders of society rode city buses. Everybody else was out on the freeway. The automobile reshaped the nation's economy in ways that had strange and unforeseen repercussions. Certainly, the car was the main force behind the economic boom of the 1920s. Refitting the human habitat to accommodate the car required vast capital expenditures that translated into jobs with rising wages and business activity with soaring profits. Real estate and construction boomed as the urban outlands were carved into home sites for the new automobile commuters. Small businesses sprouted to serve this new auto culture. Even more important, the techniques of the assembly line, pioneered by Henry Ford, quickly spread throughout American industry, resulting in a deluge of consumer goods, everything from toasters to radios, which were bought by those workers with their rising wages and businessmen with their soaring profits. But the system was booby-trapped and it would blow up in 1929. The first signs of trouble appeared out on the farms. The automobile revolutionized farm life, in many ways for the better, but it also destroyed farming as a culture, or agriculture, that is, as a body of knowledge and traditional practices, and turned it into another form of industrial production with ruinous consequences. Around 1900, fully 1/3 of the US population lived on small family farms. They had grown increasingly isolated from the benefits of industrial civilization. Medical care often lay beyond their reach. One-room schools could be dismally inadequate. A simple trip to the nearest small town might be very difficult. Henry Ford himself was a Michigan farm boy and had farmers in mind when he developed the Model T. Once farmers started getting cars, and they were some of the most avid early customers, they emptied their savings accounts and forsook indoor plumbing to buy cars. The Saturday trip to town became an overnight institution all over rural America. Farmers now had regular access to a society beyond their little hill or hollow, or to libraries, to popular culture, to ideas beside those in the family Bible. The car also lightened work by serving as a mobile power plant around the farm. With its driving wheel jacked up, its engine could run other machines, saw firewood, pump water. The improvements in rural life even spawned the expectation that urban working folk, oppressed by dreary factory labor and the fractious tenement living, would flock to the bucolic hinterlands. In fact, the opposite happened. The mechanization of the American farm disrupted the rural economy so badly that more farm boys fled to the cities than ever before, and the farm population plummeted. And then it describes how Henry Ford also sold his Fordson tractor. It wasn't just the car, it was the spread of tractors, which came with accessory machines, reapers, seed drills, threshers, diskers, mowers. So what had formerly cost farmers a great deal of labor now cost them a great deal of cash money. What followed is a prime illustration of the principle that more is not necessarily better. Mechanized farming allowed farmers to boost their output tremendously in a very short period of time. But the demand for their commodities, the whole market structure, remained much the same as it had been before. Nor did the farmers themselves stop to rethink their economic strategy in terms of, say, product diversification and specialty crops. In fact, mechanized farming lent itself to monoculture, the growing of single crops on an ever larger scale. Consequently, the supply of staple grains soared while the demand stayed relatively constant, and so prices plummeted. Catastrophically, the bottom fell out of American agriculture. Meanwhile, the farmer was introduced to another new accessory, the mortgage. He suddenly needed to borrow cash each spring to buy the fertilizer that he formerly got for free, to buy pesticides to protect his monoculture crop, which could be wiped out by one kind of bug, and to purchase new mechanical equipment to increase his production to make up for the falling price of his commodities. The farmer now entered a precarious relationship with banks, in which each year he literally bet the farm that he could bring in a profitable crop. The long-term result was the death of the family farm in America, the replacement of agriculture by agribusiness. By 1940, the percentage of the population on farms fell to 23%. By 1980, it had dwindled to 3%. In and of itself, this population shift might not have been a bad thing, but it was accompanied by another terrible cost. A way of life became simply a means of production. Human husbandry gave way to the industrial exploitation of land. Left behind was the knowledge of how to care for land, so plainly evinced in today's problems of soil erosion and in pollution from chemical pesticides and fertilizers. The cycle of overproduction, debt, and foreclosure in the late 20s was the first sign that accommodating a new technology like the motor vehicle in an established economy could be wildly disruptive. The farming situation would worsen in the 1930s when cyclical droughts in the plains combined with new mechanical means of soil cultivation to produce the Dust Bowl, a disaster of biblical dimensions. There's plenty much more which is very fascinating to read in this book, but I'm going to leave it there. Hasta luego, amigos.